In Minnesota, few neighborhoods are more important and less understood than North Minneapolis. A better understanding of the North Side can be found by exploring the community's history. Notable locations in North Minneapolis offer stories of coming to America, of learning and emerging, of common ground and hallowed ground, change and conflict, the past seen through the power of place, through Cornerstones of North Minneapolis.
Cornerstones, A History of North Minneapolis, is a co-production of the University of Minnesota Urban Research and Outreach Engagement Center and TPT's Minnesota Channel.
I work at the Sumner Library. The branch is nearly 100 years old, and every month at least one person will come into the building and they get this look on their face of, and I know that person grew up using Sumner Library.
Sumner Library, oh gosh, didn't we love it?
But it was beautiful.
It was gorgeous. And
I'm
we
sure
spent
it's still
so
lovely.
much time there because that was our home away from home.
In the summertime, we would go to Sumner Library where it was cool. Nobody had air conditioning in those days. And we would sit in the alcove and read our books. And it was just a wonderful place to grow up as a kid.
Sumner Library means a lot to me. It opened up a lot of doors for me. All these books have a story.
Great stories aren't only found in the books at Sumner Library. Stories from Sumner's century of service to North Minneapolis are a part of the building's bricks and mortar, and the countless patrons whose lives have been touched by the branch and its librarians for almost 100 years. The story of Sumner's past and future came together during a major renovation and expansion in 2005.
The librarian's railing worked in here. That's just a
The
little
architects who
window.
led the work had strong personal connections to the library and North Minneapolis.
I'm going to go in here for a second and remember what it was like to be in here, because this is where I learned how to read. I grew up right across the street. Every Saturday there used to be a reading program here at Sumner Library, and I would come over to Sumner Library and read. My father being an immigrant moving to the U.S. and the beginnings of who I am and hopefully who I'll be. So that part, that emotional connection to the library, is what I take from it.
My grandmother, who was born in Minneapolis in the 1890s, this was her library. So the way that I've become familiar with this library through this project, I visualize her path up the stairs. There had been the first North Minneapolis library closer to Broadway, built in 1890, but as the working class moved into this area, there was definitely a library service missing. Andrew Carnegie, through the Carnegie Corporation, donated $125,000 to the city of Minneapolis to build 3 libraries. There was Hosmer Library, Franklin Library, and Sumner Library. If you combine the rarity of the Tudor Revival style and its configuration, we might, even if we knew of every Carnegie library that was built over a 30-year period, not find one of this type. You see in the annual reports that this is the Minneapolis Library's first efforts to be of service to the Jewish community, and there would be special foreign language collections at certain libraries. So Sumner Library had the Yiddish and Russian collection. The readers were just voracious, and you had every square foot being used downstairs in the community room. There were programs, and it was used very intensely.
While the library branch grew, so did the city. Olson Memorial Highway, an important link between the West Metro and downtown, was on the drawing board, and the Sumner Library sat in the way.
The library board is approached and informed that they're occupying a critical site needed for this highway, Olson Memorial Parkway. Well, as long as the highway department would pay to move the building, every dollar of that move, fine. And the library was physically cut from its foundations and moved about 80 feet to the north, where it sits today. So for generations from the construction of the building, this was the entry point. And we had the opportunity to bring it back to some of that character. We opened up the skylight. We built a bench using the panels from the original circulation desk. So this is the space that people remembered. But the important place was where Miss Rood had her office, which is up here in the mezzanine. Now it's closed off because we've got mechanical space up there. But she could sit and watch all the patrons from this vantage point.
Miss Rood, well, everybody knew her, and she was a wonderful woman.
She must have been the head librarian.
She was a head librarian.
And she loved us.
There are quite a few well-loved librarians in this community. I know Grace Belton was really well-loved, and I meet many people who grew up under Grace Belton, who learned to read under Grace Belton. I'm pretty sure that anyone who was a librarian in this community feels the way I do, that it really is about connecting with the community here.
I think that just as Seytu Jones and George Roberts in their entry art piece here talks about the sedimentation of one community following another, it's not necessarily a distinct break from one community to the other, but there's a continuity of certain issues because literacy was key to each of these groups.
Sumner, became a key feature in the life of kids. The kids that grew up in North Minneapolis, in particular those who grew up around Phyllis Wheeler in the project area, all familiar with Sumner.
After decades of constant use, the wear and tear on the old library began to show.
It was just a fact that the building was deteriorating. We really did need some help. Mainly, I remember that leak constantly in the area that I would sit in.
The Minneapolis Public Library System was renovating some of its historic libraries. Architectural firms competed for the Sumner job. The team from KKE won the project, led by Sons of the North Side who were committed to keeping the community in the process.
Well, I felt, and I think you probably feel the same, is that this opportunity is not just for us, but we both go back personally with the community and with the library.
During the process, the community made their voices heard and helped shape the renovation and expansion.
The architects started to feel that we were really serious about what we wanted for our library. And what happened in that process is that we felt it was really hard. We realized how much this place meant to us,
We had community meetings with John Cole, Ron Edwards. I think we talked to everyone and assured them that our role is not just to represent the library, but it really is, as architects, to represent the community and what their interests are.
Finally, after years of planning, design, and meticulous work, the old library was restored, and the new additions were well received.
It was like a rose just, opened it up. It just came up out of the ground, and all of a sudden, there you are. And you say, it's a beautiful place, and it's the place you want to be.
The grand reopening celebrated that entryway artwork by Jones and Roberts, who created the piece with Northside youth.
Over 200 students worked on it. And there was a young Asian man named Boone who was right on the edge. So we decided, all right, we're going to take Boone and his 3 buddies for part of our crew. They were the guests of honor at the dedication, and they were so proud. Boone's mother and father couldn't come, but they came later when he just came in one day, said, George, I'm going to be there today, can you meet us there? And here's what Boone said. When he came in, and he looked around and he saw it, and he saw people coming in and out and looking at it, and his mother looked at it. He said, you see, Mom, I am worth something. So here again is the power of art, which is much larger than that piece of art over there. It's about lives.
Stories that we tell about the library are almost as important as the library itself and the architecture.
I came across a book in are historical files that talked about the immigrants coming to North Minneapolis, coming to this community. The first thing they want to do is learn English, and then they want to become citizens. Their children become regular library users within their first 6 months. And I was reading this, and yeah, I mean, this is still going on.
She's a great person. She's a great librarian. She'll help you out with anything. I just love her. She's a great person. I come here a lot. I get inspired all the time. I write poetry and I volunteer sometimes at the Homework Hub. I know that there's a rich African-American culture in North Minneapolis. I'm Somalian, but I also get inspired by African-Americans too. I can relate to them.
Welcoming new immigrant populations, people from all cultures, and having a place that is accessible, welcoming, and where you can feel safe is extremely important.
And just as the community has evolved, the buildings evolve.
I think they want us to understand how far we've come, and we're doing so many great things, and great things will happen in the future. It's like my second family. It's my home also.
We are in Sumner Field. We are in the heart of North Minneapolis.
Important park in my life was Sumner Field, which was right behind the old Phyllis Wheatley.
And Sumner Field in the winter, mainly for ice skating.
Ice skating.
Oh yes, we were good, weren't we?
From the neighborhood's early school to its historic library branch, it seems fitting that this area of near North Minneapolis carries the name of Charles Sumner, the Massachusetts senator who stood up against slavery before the Civil War. Because Sumner Field, the park, and then the housing projects that were developed around it symbolize the ongoing struggle for an inclusive, integrated America. Many of Sumner Field's early residents, escaping oppression in Eastern Europe, would have valued the abolitionist ideals of their neighborhood's namesake.
In the early 20th century, it was mainly a Jewish neighborhood. Many people had come to the United States fleeing the pogroms in Russia. And then gradually after World War II, more and more African Americans moved into the neighborhood. And so it was a very rich cultural mix.
This newspaper article celebrated a diverse who's who from the neighborhood, including North Minneapolis' stage and screen star, Hilda Sims, and the leader whose 6th Avenue, the nearby Main Street, would later be named after.
One of Minnesota's most prominent governors, Floyd B. Olson, whose childhood home was located on what later became the site of Sumner Homes. He had lots of Jewish friends. He spoke Yiddish, and he was what was called, in our grandparents' era, a Shabbos Goy, which meant that as a non-Jew, he was able to come into the homes of the observant Jewish families and light their lights on the Sabbath, something that they were not allowed to do.
The area did have a natural feature, Bassett's Creek, but it didn't receive the same kind of treatment as the waterways of South Minneapolis.
Bassett's Creek, which was this beautiful little creek flowing in from the west, became a sewer when it came through this neighborhood, and there was no effort to try to transform it into green space and parkland. It was simply put underground when it came through this neighborhood.
But the city's ambitious park board, which had been developing open space to offer respite in congested working-class neighborhoods, did create a simple park in 1910 called Sumner Field. Even a modest playing field like Sumner can add a great deal to the quality of life of a community. But as the years passed, the area and its housing came under greater scrutiny.
It was a neighborhood that combined, residents, community, and also served as a source of people's livelihoods. But this was something that was also alien to many of the housing reformers' ideas about what home and neighborhood actually ought to be. So there was a desire to completely reorder this neighborhood.
Sumner Homes was the first public housing development in Minnesota, built during the New Deal era of the 1930s.
I remember moving into the government projects in 1939, and it was so wonderful because we had a refrigerator, not an ice box. We got our first phone. My mother used to say, We are so lucky the government lets us live here. We must take very good care of this place.
It was like a family in the project. You know, you got to meet people and you became friendly, and everybody kind of watched out for one another.
In this archival video, the late Polly Young, a former resident, described how affordable housing and the Sumner Field projects helped stabilize working-class families like hers.
We didn't have much when we lived in the Sumner Field homes, and it helped us to get on our feet in life.
They lived right over in that direction in the projects, in the three-story projects.
Polly's nephew, Lawrence Simmons, lived just a stone's throw away from the projects, but he recalls that it didn't matter if you lived in the projects or just nearby. Sumner Field was the center of a larger, interconnected community.
The kids that were in the surrounding areas used this area as a central play area and community area.
Polly's husband, Chubby Young, enlisted his brothers into the barbering trade. The Young brothers became something of a barbering dynasty in the Twin Cities and were featured in Ebony magazine. Their success allowed them to move up and out of the projects.
My dad finished barber school. He put the barber shop over in South Minneapolis, and the following year we moved over to South Minneapolis. But we all pretty much started here.
Sumner housing projects had one characteristic that might surprise Minnesotans.
I enjoyed going down there, had many, many friends that lived in the projects.
And they were segregated, if you remember.
The projects were segregated,
yeah,
yes.
Which I thought, you know, now looking back on that was quite amazing.
Absolutely.
They had particular parts of Sumner Field homes that were for African Americans, another section, larger section, for what they called mixed whites.
The policy didn't last, but even when it was in place, Sumner Field diluted the damage of segregation.
Sumner Field itself, what we see the remnants of right behind me, certainly was an important common ground as recreation space.
We had white, we had the park, and we had Afro-American. And we all played together in the park. So it was quite a wonderful neighborhood to live in.
In the summertime, your parents would drop you off at the park, and that was a safe haven for you. And in the wintertime, we speed skated. This one girl, her name was Penny, and we could never get her to come out, particularly for skating, but we couldn't get her to come out. But one day we were down here skating as usual, and lo and behold, we saw Penny, and Jerry came along. He was a white kid that lived over on the white side. They started skating together. Every weekend we came down here, there was Penny and Jerry skating again. So they're married, and I believe they live in Burnsville.
And it was Sumner Field that started a long life together for Jerry and Penny. In fact, newspaper accounts suggest that the Sumner Field projects and the Glenwood projects that were developed on the south side of Olson Highway in the 50s did improve attitudes towards other races among some of the residents. But over time, the projects did become more isolated, with poor people of color making up the vast majority of residents.
An interesting thing about this area, if you map it and look at the way it changes over time, is how it becomes more and more isolated. You shoot a freeway through here, and sound wall, and it provides another barrier as well that really begins to isolate a neighborhood.
This was a community that, while it had its problems, it tried to address its problems.
There had been a number of organizations that sprung around the needs of the population.
Some of the institutions that most people would be familiar with would be Piker Head Start, started in public housing. There was their first unit there for many years. KMOJ Radio, their first location was in public housing.
It was KMOJ, and then adjacent to KMOJ was the Glenwood-Lindale Community Center, and that became really a mecca for this community. So yeah, this was really the place to be in North Minneapolis.
Starting in the 70s, Southeast Asians, refugees from the Vietnam War, were coming to Minnesota. Like others before them, they were beginning their American journey in North Minneapolis. But the North Side projects they came to call home were clearly in decline. A confluence of troubling conditions led to a lawsuit that moved local and federal agencies to change.
There was a lawsuit, the Holman settlement, which called for the redevelopment of the Sumner area.
And when they started tearing the building down, I did a walkthrough. And after they tore it down, I figured, well, I got to have something that's going to remind me of where I'm from. What we have is we have red bricks from the projects right here in North Minneapolis. This group of bricks came from KMOJ Radio, right here on this piece of land. I probably spent at least 20, 22 years broadcasting from this place right here.
KMOJ has a new home, part of several new developments on West Broadway Avenue. Like the community radio station, former residents of the projects have found new homes throughout the metro.
I met with and worked with each and every family that was relocated. Some did return, most moved on and have purchased homes, and their families have grown up, and so I miss seeing those folks.
And now we have a new mixed income development there, Heritage Park, which is actually bringing together people from different backgrounds and different housing types living in the same neighborhood. So that neighborhood has gone through quite a series of changes over really the last 100 years.
Some people that had lived there in the later years after they moved out of the project, they kind of took on a different attitude, like they didn't want nobody to know that they lived in the project. But I don't feel that way. I don't care who knows that I lived there, because those were some very happy days for us. I would never tell anybody that I didn't live in the project.
So these are the Stars of David that were up on the church. They have such a wonderful patina now. They're rusted, but they still have a strong sense of who they are and are full of history.
Educator and artist George Roberts' description of these Stars of David from the former Knesset Israel Synagogue could also describe the avenue in North Minneapolis they looked out over for several decades. The quiet residential nature of today's Plymouth Avenue belies its history as a vital artery in a bustling neighborhood. And because of racially charged riots in the late 60s, Plymouth Avenue has become Minnesota's place name for division and conflict. But the past the street represents is more complex than the headlines and simplified history suggest.
In 1946, an American journalist named Carrie McWilliams called Minneapolis the capital of anti-Semitism in the United States.
Because you have this, oppression laying over the entire community, it kept them together.
And so what that meant is that there were a lot of community institutions here, plus a whole street of shops on Plymouth Avenue.
We had Jewish bakeries.
They had a pool hall.
And a bowling
alley. A bowling alley.
And then the Homewood Theater, for heaven's sakes.
And delicatessens.
And delicatessens.
Where you can get the best sandwiches that ever were.
I dreamt about Plitman's last night. I dreamt it was still there. It was a delicatessen on Plymouth.
Stillman's. I worked there.
Yes, you did.
It was the first supermarket on Plymouth Avenue. It was a big deal.
But nostalgia alone doesn't give a full picture of the complexities of community history.
There were fissures in the Jewish community having to do with class, having to do with relationships with other communities outside the Jewish fold. I think it's very hard to tell the story, and to tell the story well without coming to grips with those internal tensions and complexities.
Plymouth Avenue ran, as the Minneapolis Tribune described it, across the Jewish community from modest homes at the Aldrich Avenue end to mansions in Homewood at the western edge.
And you have rich Jews and poor Jews. If you lived on the east side, I'm sure you knew that the people who lived in Homewood were a hell of a lot wealthier than you.
I felt the difference. We were very poor.
They made you feel that we were different.
When you grow up, you know that you're okay.
Yeah.
When you're a kid, you don't know you're okay.
But they all went to North High. They all hung out on Plymouth Avenue. So I can't say that the fissures were as deep as they were in a place like New York.
So Plymouth Avenue offered a vantage point of class differences from one side of Jewish life to the other. In the mid-60s, the street became home to a black organization that would symbolize changes in the community.
I was drawn here because of the founding of the Way in 1966. I was invited by Syl Davis, who's no longer with us, was involved in youth work.
The Way, a cutting-edge community center established in a Plymouth Avenue storefront, was at the center of racial issues when a now familiar phrase became part of the American lexicon in the late 60s.
The thing that was being talked about every year was the long, hot summers.
The long, hot summers, you know, Watts, Detroit, Newark.
The series of long, hot summers of urban rebellions that began to become regular features of the American landscape.
There were 2 consecutive summers that we had disturbances in 66 and 67. And of course, like many communities across Black America, Plymouth Avenue was occupied for a week or 2, at least a week, by American soldiers. We shouldn't forget that.
The accounts vary as to how and why the riots started on those summer nights of the 60s. A young emerging leader from the Way named Harry Spike Moss pointed out that it was the long winters of do-nothing that led to the long, hot summers of violence. This statement does seem to capture the sense of disillusionment, the lack of opportunity, education, and jobs at the end of the civil rights era. While the outbreaks called needed attention to these issues, they also accelerated the exodus of Jewish residents out of North Minneapolis.
People that owned the businesses on Plymouth Avenue, these people were immigrants. They came with nothing, started with push carts. Most of them were just poor people trying to eke out a living, and they were burnt out. And that, to me, that is the sadness that I feel sometimes when I think about North Minneapolis.
There had always been some tensions, but my family always had a nice rapport with the Jewish merchants along Plymouth Avenue, and but times were different. I mean, it was exploding all over America at that time.
I think as a community with the labor and liberal roots, community that saw itself as largely progressive, community that understood that it had common cause to make with other marginalized communities, came as quite a shock that Jews were nevertheless identified as on the other side. And I think it makes perfect sense for Jews to be uncomfortable with the fact that the dynamic had something to do with Jews being absorbed into the larger privileged sectors of American society more quickly than African Americans, and perhaps a sense of guilt to some degree about that occurring, but a willingness to benefit from that process in ways that I think African Americans saw frustrating, and perhaps saw more clearly and more starkly than most members of the Jewish community could allow themselves to consider.
And so the Avenue was the code word for all of that history. It was never even called Plymouth, it was just called the Avenue.
Older people who were there, and remember this, don't want to talk about it. It's very significant to know that the police precinct is exactly on Plymouth Avenue where the Way was. That's more than symbolic, that's erasure.
I think it's important to keep in mind that there was a significant degree of movement by Jews out of the North Side much earlier, dating back to returning GIs in the 1940s.
In fact, the Jewish migration was just part of a larger movement out of North Minneapolis and the urban core.
My family moved. We were one of the first families to move to St. Louis Park, so all of my Jewish friends that I had in North Minneapolis were still my friends when I went to St. Louis Park.
One of the big turning points, I would say, was when Bethel decided to move. That was a big fight.
And that's when I was running around telling, don't move, don't move. I didn't want to see everybody disperse, and they did. And so many of the congregation followed.
Our family did not follow that pattern, and I am forever grateful for the opportunity to have spent the rest of my childhood years on the North Side.
When I meet anybody new, the first thing they'll say is, are you still there? I say, yes. Well, aren't you afraid of the blacks? That's the other question. And tell them that they're my best friends. So, and this whole neighborhood is very mixed. Very, very mixed. We have the Hmong and the Vietnamese and the blacks and the Jew. And, and so it's terrific.
So even after the Plymouth Avenue riots, Dorothy Jacobs, Earl Swartz, and other Jewish residents remained on the North Side. At that time, new families were moving in, including idealistic young educators like George and Beverly Roberts.
Many teachers moved in. On my block at one point, there were 6 teachers. And so there was a great rebuilding of a community here around the kind of social issues that you associate with the 60s.
Much of this spirit and leadership came from Bernadette Anderson, who lived just off Plymouth on Russell Avenue. An activist and civic leader, Anderson was like a mother to the community and became the mother of the Minneapolis Sound in the 70s when she took in a neighborhood teen.
My mother, I miss and I love her. Bernadette Anderson took Prince into our home. He went to school with my brother Andre, and he was having problems at home. And my mother let Prince stay while he worked out his problems at home. He ended up having a career from our home. Prince would leave our home here and he would catch the bus to Central High.
So in a way, Plymouth was Prince's avenue to success in arts and entertainment. George Roberts saw the potential of community building through creative expression in an old pickle factory across the street from Prince's bus stop.
And this particular building was a grocery store, clothing store, an Amway store for a while, a hardware store, whatever the community needed. By the 80s, we had a couple of neighborhood inconvenience stores here, and there was some drug selling that was going on, so the community got together and drove those people out of business and out of the neighborhood. And then I continued walking by on my way to North in the 80s, saying, "Why, that's a beautiful old building." We bought this place, and the vision was, art, it creates the bridge. And these are the last 3 buildings from that period of the Plymouth Avenue business complex. From here all the way to the river. These are the last 3 buildings.
Recently, Roberts salvaged those iconic Stars of David from a Plymouth Avenue building that had been a church, synagogue, then church again.
I think they could easily create a monument or a sculpture piece that sits out along Plymouth Avenue. But that's the sense that we have from living here. There is a history we want to preserve, and that's, I think, what all of us who have buildings here is feeling. This is at least one place where we can start to point and say, Plymouth is a place that's got deep roots.
Oh, this is wonderful. Cornerstone is still there. Yeah, it's the date in Hebrew. I have a lot of very warm, fond memories of the Manuel Cohen Center. And this building was kind of a haven for me during my, grade school years and even my junior high years.
For the past few decades, Pillsbury United Communities Oak Park Center has served a neighborhood largely made up of blacks and other people of color. Generations before, it was the Emanuel Cohen Center, which met the human service needs of a booming Jewish community. The foundation for the Cohen Center was laid in the 1880s when a religious school, which would later become the Talmud Torah, was founded to serve a growing North Side Jewish community.
Unlike many Jewish communities, synagogues didn't necessarily define the center of gravity for Jewish life on the North Side. And other institutions instead, particularly educational institutions, the Talmud Torah in particular, had central roles to play in the development of Jewish life.
After meeting in synagogues during its early years, the Talmud Torah moved into its own building on Bassett Place in 1910. Just a few years later, a new structure was built on Fremont Avenue that allowed the institution to expand its services.
That building provided a number of services within this one building. It wasn't just the afternoon Hebrew school.
Well, the Talmud Torah emerged in the 1930s, 1940s as a center for active, progressive Jewish life in Minneapolis. The faculty, their prominence in Jewish life in one way or another, in community life, its embrace of Hebrew as the Jewish language of the future, all of which propelled it to a central role in Jewish life in the community.
It spun off a community center really very similar to the traditional settlement houses that were established in the 19th century.
The settlement house idea was that it was of the neighborhood. The people who worked there lived at the house, and the idea was it was a place like going to your neighbors.
One of the reasons that Emanuel Cohn was established in the early 1920s is Jewish leaders were very concerned about Jewish juvenile delinquency.
There were other settlement houses. There was Wells Settlement House that was founded by St. Mark's Episcopal Church. There was Unity House. There were other settlement houses in this neighborhood. And Jewish kids did belong to them. But there was not a community house that could service the particular needs not only of the Jewish kids, but of the African American kids.
What African Americans had as a cultural bookend to the Cohn Center was the Phyllis Wheatley Settlement House a few blocks east. The two movements had both begun one after the other in that old Bassett Place building. In its second building on Bassett Place, Phyllis Wheatley served the many needs of the neighborhood and would become the center of the Black Renaissance in Minnesota. African American women in leadership realized the serious challenges facing young women, youth, and families in North Minneapolis. They eventually garnered the support of the women of the city's milling families through the Women's Christian Association, and W. Gertrude Brown was hired as the first head resident of the settlement.
Phyllis Wheatley provided athletics, academics, babysitting, the arts. They were kind of the mecca of everything that children either weren't getting in the public schools or even didn't go to school.
Davis's father, the late Harry Davis Sr., was a prodigal son of the Phyllis Wheatley settlement.
Well, actually, I was born in April of 1923. And Phyllis Wheatley started exactly a year later, in 1924.
Dad brought the name recognition up to another level because of the success they had in the boxing program.
Harry Davis's success as a boxer and coach, a professional, and political pioneer speaks volumes to the impact of the Phyllis Wheatley Settlement House and its staff.
Gertrude Brown, she was very active in politics and economics, primarily education. She designed Phyllis Wheatley. She designed the rooms for students and homeless people. She designed the nursery school and set up the meetings for all of the organizations in the area. Gertrude Brown designed that.
By his successes in civics and sports, they always identified Harry Davis with Phyllis Wheatley. So that kept Phyllis Wheatley in the limelight.
We sometimes forget when we talk about the Phyllis Wheatley House and with Gertrude Brown's arrival here to take leadership thereof, that this was in 1924. And it's right at the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. Ethel Ray Nance, again, who had connections also with the Phyllis Wheatley House, would go on to become a secretary for Charles S. Johnson and W.E.B. Du Bois later on.
In this photo of Nance at the Wheatley House, you can see a rendering of the slave poetess Phyllis Wheatley, the settlement's namesake, created by the Harlem Renaissance's most notable artist.
And one of the paintings that the Phyllis Wheatley holds is a painting by a young black visual artist named Aaron Douglas, who became the single most famous painter of the Harlem Renaissance. Local musicians, people like Percy Hughes and members of Oscar Pettiford's family, for them the Phyllis Wheatley House was a central part of their development.
And this is Sarah Vaughn.
That's a nice picture too. Ira, all the best.
Northsider Ira Pettiford, along with his brother, well-known musician Oscar Pettiford, were notable names on the national jazz scene. Ira's widow, Jean Pettiford, recalls cooking for some of the biggest names in jazz at the Phyllis Wheatley House.
So on the north side, there was a Phyllis Wheatley, and that's how you got cooking for folks when they came to town, because they'd stay at the Wheatley and they'd want some good food, and you would prepare it.
I sure did. Father Hines, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday. North Minneapolis just seemed like home.
Jean Pettiford, who is white, says that Ira and Oscar Pettiford are as much Native American as they are African American, a reminder of the diversity found on the north side and at the Phyllis Wheatley settlement.
It wasn't all African Americans. My first nursery school picture at Phyllis Wheatley, there were 7 Caucasians, 4 African Americans, and 1 Asian.
But in the de facto segregation of the Twin Cities, Wheatley was the cornerstone of Minnesota's black cultural and social life.
I took piano lessons there. I played basketball. We could go there and it was friendly. And so that's where our parents sent us, and that's where we had our best times.
My mother's from St. Paul. My father is from the north side, and Phyllis Wheatley was his social network. And he used to court my mother along the streetcar along University Avenue to pick her up and bring her back. And so it was a safe place for young people to meet and to have a good time. And marriages happened, and I guess we're kind of missing that in the community right now.
Through the 50s and 60s, the settlements were changing. Funders were demanding mergers to remove duplication.
We were the lone black agency in that mix. We were not forced into the merger, but Wells Memorial and Unity merged.
The names of these organizations were evolving in a way that reflected change as well.
And as they merged, a lot of them started using words like neighborhood services or neighborhood centers or things like that, partly because nobody in the outside world understood what settlement meant anymore. So I'd get calls like, can I get my insurance claim taken care of?
Although it survived the settlement mergers, Phyllis Wheatley, a building that housed a great deal of Minnesota history, was in the path of the new Interstate 94.
And so a building was sold to the highway department, and that left Phyllis Wheatley without a home.
But the sale of the building gave Wheatley the resources to buy into the construction of a new Park School Community Center complex in 1970. Today, a diverse population of Northsiders are served by Phyllis Wheatley House, 80-plus years after it began in that old building on Bassett Place, the same long-gone structure that produced the Emanuel Cone Center. For its part, the Cone Center moved to St. Louis Park with a westward migrating Jewish community in 1963, where it was reestablished as the Venerable Jewish Community Center.
Which is a very highly used building to this day.
For everybody.
Uh-huh.
Black, Gentile, Jew.
And everybody is
everybody.
welcome. Everybody is very welcome there.
Pillsbury United Communities got involved with this property in about 1980. So yeah, there's a lot of history in this particular room for me and for the community. So, one of the great things about settlement houses, I think, is that they've changed all the time to try to figure out what they are. And I think that's a good thing.
Well, to B'nai Jacob, what I can tell you about it is that it's the only synagogue on the north side that fulfills one of the traditions within Judaism, that the synagogue should be built on a hill. It should be built in the highest part of a neighborhood, and that its roof should be the highest roof in the neighborhood. And B'nai Jacob is the only one that really fulfills that.
This temple is fulfilling other traditions of houses of worship in North Minneapolis history. Over a half-century ago, the building changed from synagogue to black church when B'nai Jacob moved west and the Church of God in Christ moved in.
And it thrills me to see how these synagogues are still standing here and now are being used as African-American churches, because what it does, it reminds people that at one time there was a Jewish community here. But on the other hand, it's telling people also that there's an African-American, a very vibrant, vital African-American community here as well. And at one time, those communities coexisted.
The early days of the North Side, there were a sprinkling of synagogues, at least a half a dozen, many within just a block or two of each other, but they tended to have an ethnic base. There was Knesset Israel, which is where my ancestors belong. My grandfather helped found that congregation in the 1890s. There was the, as we called them, the Morgan Shul and the Logan Shul, and they were all identified by the street that they were on. There was Mikra Kodesh.
Mikro Kodesh's second structure remains the architectural landmark synagogue of North Minneapolis. The Byzantine-influenced temple on Oliver Avenue was built in the mid-20s.
Mikra Kodesh was once known as the synagogue of the men from Russia, and they changed their name to Mikra Kodesh because why should they remember Russia and all of its repressions?
In recent decades, the building has been the center of Pastor Paul's food shelf. Interestingly, since the 1990s, many of those seeking help have included Russian immigrants, finding support in a structure built by Russian Jews generations earlier. Along with Mikro Kodesh, another notable architectural landmark in North Minneapolis can be found in the Old Highland neighborhood on Bryant Avenue.
We're sitting in the Church of the Ascension, one of the jewels of religious architecture, honestly, in the upper Midwest. For anyone from the North Side, that they really had an interracial, interethnic, interreligious community, even though, of course, it was all under this Irish-American hierarchy.
Ascension was kind of like a second home to a lot of the Mexican family, Latino families here.
I remember Ascension as being a very powerful kind of place and a very special place.
This gym, if it could talk, it had a lot of things to say.
Ascension was built on the grounds of an old farm. It opened up in 1890, and it was a relatively small community, but it began to grow rapidly. By the turn of the century, they built a new church. School had opened in the mid-1890s, I believe, so that within 2 generations, it became the cornerstone of what would be one of the largest Catholic communities in Minnesota itself. Father, later Monsignor John Dunphy, known also as the mayor of the North Side, just for reference. John Dunphy, born in Ireland. After he was ordained, he became the dean at St. Thomas. He was sent to Minneapolis. Dunphy was probably the perfect candidate for this. There was a sense that these new Catholics were kind of like the Visigoths on the North Side, threatening St. Paul's Rome. They were a bit unruly, and Dunphy was more of the kind of tough, street-smart type of priest that could deal with it.
These street smarts included Father Dunphy's dominance as a boxer. He would make boxing a key pillar of Ascension's youth engagement.
If he knew there was an altercation among young men, if he caught them fighting on the playground, they had to go into the gym and settle it the right way, as he said.
Memorable Golden Glove matches and prize fights took place in the multi-purpose gym in the building known as the Ascension Club.
It was built shortly after World War I. It had a 5-lane swimming pool. It had bowling alleys, this giant gym, full performance stage, all these club rooms. So it was a great center for drawing people together.
Wow, this gym has tons of history. When you were playing a team from the North Side, you had the St. Bridget's, you had the St. Austins, you had the St. Anne's. This place was packed.
We used this for dances, Mexican dances. And we used it for children's parties. We used it for a lot of festivals. We had our organization here. Centro Cultural Chicano was housed in this facility.
The Ascension Club was like a Catholic settlement house. It was to be the anchor of a community.
Just as Ascension was culturally dominated by Irish and German Catholics, the Orthodox synagogues of North Minneapolis were also ethnically based.
This was Tefereth B'nai Jacob.
This synagogue is a wonderful example of immigrant synagogues. It was formed by a group of people from a particular community in Bessarabia, which is the borderland between Russia and Romania, called Filister, and it was known as the Filister Shul.
Well, it looks like much of the interior hasn't changed. The ark where the Torah scrolls were kept, I see, still has its hinges on it.
My one memory of this building was when Henry Wallace came here to speak. It was quite an event to have somebody of that stature coming to a synagogue on the north side to speak. But of course, the Socialist Hall was just down the block of ways, so it made sense that this is the congregation he would speak at.
In the 40s and 50s, Jewish Northsiders, like others in the post-war era, were migrating to the suburbs, moving, changing, and merging surviving synagogues as they went west. Tifereth B'nai Jacob sold its Hilltop Synagogue to the Church of God in Christ. This changing of hands and the demographic shifts it represented didn't go unnoticed at the time, as seen in this news account.
It was considered a very, very significant move.
When I came here was in 1957. My wife and I shared the same dwelling with a Jewish couple. We lived on Newton Avenue North, and we lived in an upper duplex above the Mr. and Mrs. Zenith. And there was always a very good rapport with us. As a matter of fact, they would have the children down sometimes.
The changing North Side was reflected in the Ascension Parish and school as well.
By the late 60s into the 1970s, you would see a minority of African Americans, and you would also see the beginnings of the Latino population who began to make their presence known.
I was the 18th child. We have a large family here. This has been our home. Ascension's meant a lot to us. A lot of folks think that we're new to this community. No, we're not. We were born and raised in this community.
Let's see, I started in kindergarten. There were 2 families of color that were here at that time. Yes, I was the only one in my class. This is where I began, and I am very fortunate to be able to teach here. Now, it's time for me to give back to kids and to my community. The buildings, it's really funny, you'll find people walking on the playground, can I help you? I went to school here. Oh, really? And people just come wandering back. People just kind of grab at their past, and you want to see where you came from.
In 1890, this parish was welcoming immigrants. And here we are in the beginning of the 3rd century of this school, and what's going on? Immigrants.
We find a shrine here fashioned out of a former confessional to Our Lady of Guadalupe, indicating that the real Catholic population base is now, of course, Latino.
And so we have a lot of Mexicanos, Chicanos, Latinos in this community that come to Ascension and are proud to be part of Ascension.
And we've got African immigrants and we've got Asian immigrants. And as we say on the north side, I'm blessed.
Knesset Israel was one of the first synagogues established on the north side, and this Plymouth Avenue structure was its last home in the neighborhood before moving to the western suburbs. In the 80s, the building became the home of the New Salem Baptist Church.
This building is the second building that the church, New Salem Missionary Baptist Church, had acquired. And they had acquired it from a Jewish congregation when it was Murderapolis. The first meetings for the gang summit right here at this building, serving, mediating. Jesse Jackson has been in this building. That after we formed United for Peace, every mediation was held right at this building. And so when I think of this area and this building, we cut our teeth in ministry right here.
Long-standing churches like Wayman AME and Zion Baptist have deep roots on the north side. And when the tornado of 2011 struck North Minneapolis, black churches were among the first to respond.
People came together and they didn't care about what's the name of your church, what's the name of your pastor. They came because they had a need. And we were just grateful that we were part of that process in helping people, as many people as we could.
Most of these vital congregations now work out of newer buildings, but First Church remains proud guardians of their historic temple.
Centuries ago, we talked about synagogues, and that's where the worships and those kinds of things. Jesus would go into the synagogues and preach and so forth. And so we happen to have a synagogue.
We're glad to fit into the history of the north side.
I haven't been in here since probably the 50s. And looking into that door and remembering the Torahs in that cabinet, and then seeing the light coming through on the a stained glass window, it's very exciting for me. It makes me feel very, very happy to know that somebody else is enjoying this beautiful building and loving it. Obviously, they take good care of it.
Their existence here and in this neighborhood and at this particular synagogue at that time, church, to know that that is yet in their hearts, says that all men are of one blood. There's a love that yet goes on among mankind. And so in this building, we're glad to know that we can share the meaning with them.
She was a cheerleader.
The first African-American cheerleader in the city.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting because I know when Marilyn came by the house, she was telling us some different things about, you know, hair and the like and the things that her mother did. And I thought, really? She did? Never would I have thought that,
she straightened my
that
hair.
her hair had to be straightened.
They straightened my hair.
And, of course, my hair had to be straightened also.
We both
years
know
ago.
about Dushan, don't we?
Yes.
And then we would go to Lincoln into the swimming pool. And what happened?
To communicate with people, you know, I just wish that I had known this. I wish I had known that she pressed her hair years ago, you know, because it would have made us closer, made us see how, even though the color might be different, how really we're not so different.
But, you know, this is why history is interesting, talking to people with different perspectives, because we each bring a different perspective, and that's what makes it three-dimensional.
Cornerstones, A History of North Minneapolis, is a co-production of the University of Minnesota Urban Research and Outreach Engagement Center and TPT's Minnesota Channel.